Thank you very much, Bob. That was a really long introduction. But I wanted to lead because I remember when I gave my confirmation seminar, I had to teach Bob and David how to pronounce my name, so that's how I was like reacting to him. I'm Vera Horigue. Yeah, it's Horigue. Anyway, so title of my thesis is basically scaling up to form marine protected area networks. And I'm looking at the role of coordination of initiatives and institutional collaborations in the Philippines. It's a long title, it's a really complex topic, but over the 40 minutes, I'll walk you through it. And my supervisors include Bob Christie, and where's Simon? Hi! Simon, Mike Kabini is currently in China, and as Bob mentioned already, Vera Horigue of the Marine Science Institute. So, with the first term, what is a marine protected area network? So, it's an interacting system of MPAs that are designed to meet objectives that a single MPA cannot achieve. So, it addresses principles of complementarity, and they were designed to maintain ecosystem function and encompassing larger scales and temporal scales. So, for a network to provide greater ecological and socioeconomic benefits, they have to be well-planned and well-managed. And we don't have to look that far for a well-planned and well-managed MPA because we have the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park here. And it's notable for the planning and the management. And one of the big benefits of MPA networks has been demonstrated by the work of Hugo Harrison and here in the GBR is that it promotes larval dispersal between the MPAs and outside the MPAs. And this is really important because it increases protection of the fish, and then it also promotes protection and larval and recovery from large-scale disturbances. And so the GBR went through a lot of planning, and then it's notable for the management and looking at it has a lot of considerations, and this involves spatial and temporal considerations. Because marine ecosystems are highly connected, we have to know what's in there, we have to know where things go. So in this case, sometimes you could establish them in one go, and in some cases you have to roll them out in succeeding years. And this is an actual island in the Philippines, it's Lubang Island. And this is just a demonstration. This is not the actual how the MPA network there was rolled out, but it's just conceptual that it can be done like that. And for obvious reasons, planning and management requires a lot of science and information management because you have to know what the habitats are, you have to know where things go, and then you have in marine spatial planning, you have to have we use analytical tools that are used by decision makers and scientists to design equitable and feasible MPA network plans, such as, for example, like this. You could zone in out in different kinds of ways. And another consideration is the socioeconomic considerations, because usually you have a lot of people that are using the resources in those areas. And in the case of the Philippines, these dots are actually points where fishermen fish. And then if you're establishing an MPA network, you have to consider the opportunity costs when you're establishing it and managing it. And then at the same time, lastly, you have to consider institutions and governance, because in governance capacity is required when high governance capacity is required when you're managing your MPAs, and it's quite hard to implement big blocks or system of MPAs when you have really fine scale governance units. And so it can be quite challenging to establish and implement MPA networks in areas with high resource dependence and this small, multiple disparate governance units. So that brings me to the Coral Triangle. So the Coral Triangle is known for its high population, high biodiversity, and the numerous and different kinds of socioeconomic and governance issues. And the Philippines is one of those countries with this high biodiversity population and resource dependence. And we're also known for our highly decentralized governance system wherein the national government devolved much of its responsibilities to the local governments. So, for example, the local governments are in charge mostly for planning and management of natural resources. And this has partly led to the extensive implementation of MPAs. So as Bob mentioned earlier, there's over 1,000 MPAs in the Philippines, and most of them are locally established and managed, as shown in the purple crosses. And they've been demonstrated, some of them have been demonstrated to show that they can achieve local conservation and fisheries objectives, as seen in the research, for instance, of Gary Russ and Angel Alcala. But most of these MPAs are still not that designed well because they're not designed to form MPA networks, and then they're not managed well. Some of them are considered paper parks, actually. So that's why it was recommended that we should scale up our MPAs so that we could improve management and establishment and design. And that has led to my research. So I wanted to see, because everyone's recommending, oh, let's do MPA networks and over the past decades, and then let's work together. But no one really knows how to scale up these small, locally established MPAs. And then at the same time, we don't know how it improves the design of the networks as well. So, and how do they perform in terms of management? Are they well managed, or are the individual MPAs getting better in terms of management as well? And what are the factors that influences the management? So this is my thesis questions and my research questions, and each question corresponds to a chapter. So the first chapter, I looked at how to scale up MPAs to form networks. So it's a review, and I talked to MPA experts as well in the Philippines of how we went from individual MPAs to MPA networks, so that I could describe the framework used for scaling up, and then to determine how many are in the country, and then to present the initial findings on the benefits and challenges in terms of establishment and governance and management. So second term, it'll be scaling up. So scaling up is coordinated and integrated management approaches with a regional perspective. So it's joint initiatives from planning to management, and then you go from larger areas. So it involves 3 kinds of expansion. You start from, geographically, you start from local areas, then you go to bigger areas. Obviously, when you do this, you need to expand functionally as well. So you have to involve more people and more institutions. So you have to have to modify your organizational structure and define which institutions and people are going to do certain activities. And then lastly, you have temporal expansion, wherein you think or prioritize your activities. What are you going to do first in terms of management? Are you going to prioritize awareness campaigns and enforcement, because you require compliance for your new MPAs? Which areas do you need to protect first, and things like that. And then you do all these 3 in other areas, so you duplicate it in other areas. So in the Philippines, this is how we scale up. The first is we establish a small network of MPAs, so among local governments, and then eventually you form larger networks or alliances that cover entire coasts or entire bays. And then next you continue doing that until you cover your corridors. Corridors are important because there are areas, marine biodiversity corridors are areas wherein they straddle 2 seascapes. So this one straddles the Sulu Sea and the Visayan Sea region, and this one straddles the West Philippine Sea and the Visayan Sea. And then you go further up to the seascape level. So you have your networks all in the West Philippine Sea, for example. And then the regional level would be the Philippines in the Coral Triangle. So let's backtrack a bit. What constitutes an MPA network? Earlier I talked about the ecological definitions of a network, but since you involve, when you go from smaller places to larger places, there are also more people. So it also involves a social component. So a social MPA network is considered as individuals and or institutions that interact and share information, resources, and responsibilities. An example of this is the Philippine MPA Support Network, which I'm a part of as well. And it's an information network of MPA experts in the Philippines from different sectors like the academia, the private sector, the NGOs. We have a network of a national network of fishermen and community-based MPA practitioners, and it's called Pamanaka sa Kalikasan. And then you also have your LMMAs. If you go outside in the Philippines, there's this entire big network of locally managed marine areas too, with people. So going from this is what we're trying to do. So if we're moving from a social network to a social and ecological network, wherein your individual MPAs, your management institutions, and constituencies are operating together to fulfill ecological and socioeconomic and governance aims more effectively. So that's where we're trying to move. So usually we start as a social network, and then eventually it becomes a social ecological network. And then, so we have this social MPA networks, which are also called institutional collaborations in some cases. And there are around 40 in the Philippines, as indicated in the map. They vary in sizes, so like this is quite huge, and this is also huge. And you have a lot of small ones too. And since they're all located in different parts of the Philippines, they have different geopolitical attributes. And they also have different histories, because some of them originally started as fisheries management councils, where they coordinate and work together for better enforcement of their fisheries laws. And then eventually they decide to, okay, let's work together to establish MPAs. And then that also constitutes an MPA network. And so just looking at the map and graphs, as I said earlier, some of them are quite small, and actually most of the networks so far, out of the 40, they're quite small because they range from 2 to 10 local governments working together. And then most of this also have just between 1 to 10 MPAs, although there's some that are quite huge too. And lastly, in terms of the cumulative area, it's still quite small because it only ranges from 1 to 10 square kilometers. So the take from this would be smaller networks, high number of MPAs, and relatively small total cumulative area. Ooh, that's fun. So the benefits of the networks, because they're sharing information, resources, and responsibilities, includes enhanced enforcement, and they say it's better for management of MPAs, improved design, and they have coordinated responses to threats. And it also facilitates conflict resolution because people meet and talk to each other. And then since they're a network, so you have this expanding thing, and so they tend to empower more individuals and communities. The challenges. So one of the challenges include designing MPA networks may be too technical. For instance, because some of the local governments don't have access to research and information, so they don't know the concepts, for instance, about connectivity and larval dispersal and hydrodynamics. So those networks that have benefited from projects from bridging organizations have been able to get this, but others don't. And the same with problems with individual MPAs. There's problems with strong leadership, sustainable financing, and at the network level, they found that based on the interviews with the experts, that the personal backgrounds and interests of key people also affect their working relationships. So with all these benefits and challenges, I went and tried to find out what are they really like. So with the second chapter, I looked at how much benefit do we get from scaled up MPA expansion. So I'm looking at the design of the networks in this case. So what we did was to simulate the expansion of MPA networks using 7 different scenarios. And then I tried to determine the difference in achieving habitat representation objectives for each of the scenarios, and then measured the potential advantages of coordination compared to uncoordinated community-based establishment. So when I say to coordinate, or coordinate establishment, it also means to scale up. So how do you plan and establish MPA networks? Systematic conservation and planning is assumed to be the best way to plan your MPA networks because it recognizes broader scale objectives. So in this graph, we have time, and then we have on the x-axis and progress toward the objective, such as, for instance, habitat representation on the y-axis. So but then systematic conservation planning has a poor track record of translating into local actions. So we're not sure what happens really. And whereas local actions, they're effective in terms of achieving local scale conservation and fisheries objectives. But since they're established individually and in a smaller area and without that broad perspective, they're not able to achieve broader objectives. So scaling up, we're assuming that it's able to bridge the gap between the two. So, but then we don't really know where these curves really are. So this is still quite conceptual. So I did the simulations and I used the Verde Island Passage as my study region. So this map shows the different colors are the 5 provinces and the surrounding the passage. And then there's 36 municipalities within this red region at the bottom. So I chose the Verde Island Passage because it's called the Center of Marine Biodiversity by Carpenter and Springer in 2005. And since that publication came out, the national government mandated the protection of the passage. So there are now working MPA networks in the passage. So for the scenarios, I said 7, but I'll just talk about the 2. The first scenario is the uncoordinated community-based establishment, wherein local governments and their communities establish MPAs individually. And then the other scenario is partial coordination, wherein you have 2 to 5 local governments working together. So just a background on the scenarios, the uncoordinated time was based on from 1991 until 2007, wherein they had really small square kilometers. I'm getting lost, sorry. So you have MPAs on the bars, and the line shows the total area protected. So you can see that it was really small with just a total of 8.7 square kilometers. But when the network started in 2008, it suddenly increased from 30 MPAs to 69 MPAs, and then shoot up to 170 square kilometers. So we wanted to demonstrate how this would be, and as you can see that the protection increased 20 times. So in terms of study design, it's quite hard, but we used a combination of data to create suitability layers and expansion rules. And for the data, we use habitat maps and MPA data from Conservation International and the key informant interviews as well to guide to create the suitability layers, or how we made a model so that you could choose, predict the suitability of 1 square or 1 pixel being selected. And then spatial context is guided by policy information, which is just the governance units. And then the expansion rules, we created non-systematic decision trees and systematic, which is the Markson, but I'm just talking about the non-systematic decision trees for now. And then we used the objective from the CDI and POA, or the National Plan of Action in the Coral Triangle, which aims to protect, which mandates or suggests that we should protect about 20% of the habitats until 2020. And then we compare the scenarios in terms of their achievements of targets. So this is a map showing the selection frequency for the uncoordinated scenarios. So selection frequency is the likelihood of the pixel being selected. And you can see that a lot of the MPAs are the reserves are just being placed along the coast because one of the drivers for establishment is distance to the shoreline. Whereas the partially coordinated, it's like boom, is so it expanded some of the MPAs, and because it's part of the decision rules. And at the same time, it protected a lot of areas because the suitability layer was created with more information apart from habitats and distance to shoreline, because we included pelagic species, upwelling areas, and socioeconomic attributes. So in terms of the results for this, so the current network, we didn't know this before. I only found out when we did the models, is that the current network achieved the targets for 3 habitat types already. So seagrass, reef, mangroves. And whereas with terms of the added area in the model, all the targets are actually achieved in 8 years. So they're able to achieve this targets as well. This one's barely. But as you can see, the coordinated scenario protected more habitats. So conclusions so far, because this is still a work in progress, because we just finished the model recently. It was shown that the uncoordinated establishment is good for protecting narrow infringing habitats, and that it was able to achieve targets because there were more MPAs that were established. But for the uncoordinated establishment, the current network, achieved targets for some of the habitats, and that the model also showed that we could achieve the targets as well. And it potentially achieved more habitats too, because we just evaluated 7 habitats, but it could have protected a lot more, seeing as the middle portion of the passage was also being selected and protected. So the third chapter involves looking at the management performance of the MPA networks. So to do this, we developed a tool and a combination of methods to evaluate the management performance of networks. And we tested the methods by looking at different kinds of networks with different histories and attributes. And then we inferred how management of individual MPAs and MPA networks influence each other. So I wanted to see if management becomes really better if you're in a network. So before I go to management performance, what is management effectiveness first? So it's important to evaluate it because it determines the degree to which management actions are achieving the goals of the end objectives of a protected area. And management effectiveness is important because it promotes the adaptive management cycle, and it improves project prioritization and project planning. And ways to do this would be to look at the capacity and competency of the people. Do they really have the skills and appropriate knowledge to do their jobs? Or you could look at the management performance, or wherein you look at the management actions being implemented. Are they really implementing those management actions? And then you could also look at the outcomes of these actions by doing surveys and biophysical assessments and looking at the reefs to see if protection has been impacting positively the reserves. Or you could also look at the overall state of the conservation of MPAs and the network, wherein you do all of that as the evaluation for the each. Most people tend to look at management performance and outputs because it's a proxy of a measure of outcomes. Because evaluating the overall state of the conservation and looking at the outcomes can be timely and costly. So that's why management performance is sometimes is used as a surrogate for that. So what is management performance? It's the consistency of implementation of management strategies through outputs. So these include laws and plans. And simply put, it's just basically looking at if the managers are doing what they're supposed to do. So what is management performance? So we set this definition in the context of the MPA networks in the Philippines, and we define it as the level of effort to enhance and sustain management of MPAs and coordinate expansion of MPAs among multiple governance units. So we define this, and we're assuming that high management performance could lead to high management effectiveness. This is what we wanted to do, but for now, we're just doing management performance. So the methods, I used a combination of qualitative and quantitative methods, but my methods was really complex. But for now, so I'll just talk about two of the things that I did, which is using the management performance tools and community perception surveys. So to look at the performance of networks and MPAs, I used the tool, the MPA NEAT Management Effectiveness Assessment tool, which is created by the MPA Support Network. It's now the most commonly used tool in the Philippines, so I developed the network tool to complement the MPA NEAT. So I evaluated 3 networks with a total of 62 MPAs, and I implemented the tools through focus group discussions. I complemented the management performance assessment as well with community perception surveys with fishers and non-fishers to ask them about their awareness of MPAs and networks, the functionality of the management, and since we couldn't look at management, we couldn't do surveys underwater and everything like that, we just asked them about the benefits of MPAs and their perceptions that the fisheries is improving because of the MPAs. So my case study areas included Batangas, MPA and Enforcement Network. It's one of the largest networks in the Philippines. It's a provincial network that was established in 2007, and it has 42 MPAs with a total of 17 square kilometers. The management is mixed, so there are private institutions that manage the MPAs, and there are communities that manage the MPAs. And we also have Camotes Sea CRM Council. So the council was established in 2006. And it's a group of 5 local governments with 12 MPAs in total. The management is done by the village or government. And then we have the third one, the Lanuza Bay Development Alliance. It's one of the oldest existing groups in the Philippines, which is formed by 7 local governments and with 17 MPAs and with a total of 7.93 square kilometers. So the management is done mostly by communities. So these people's organizations are formed by fishermen that form groups. So this is the result of the network evaluation. So it's a spider plot. And these are the management categories in the tool. So Batangas scored excellent in the tool, and because it has basically achieved all the indicators. Whereas Camotes was only very good because they have good legal bases and work plans, but they've been poor with monitoring and enforcement in their joint activities because they don't have the manpower and the gears at the moment during the assessment. And lastly is Lanuza, which scored fair in the tool. Historically, Lanuza was formed for fisheries and MPAs, but then they have shifted their focus to more on development, so that's why they're losing their activities for their MPA networks. So this is just a graph to show how the MPAs expanded in all the 3 sites. The pink line shows when they started the talks, and then the red line shows where they've been formalized. So as you can see that there's an increasing trend of how MPAs are established. But it also depends on the area geographically. So Camotes couldn't expand that much anymore because if you remember in the map, it's just 3 small islands. In the individual MPA assessment, Batangas, the percent of the MPAs in Batangas were only, the ones that are managed well are only 62%. The management, people's perception of management was high because they could see that the patrollers are there, they had public hearings, and they had buoys, and the guardhouse was maintained. And the people perceived that the illegal fishing had decreased, particularly glass fishing and cyanide fishing, but some people still use illegal gears. And then people believe that the MPAs do not contribute much to improving the fisheries resources in the area because they feel like the typhoons have battered the reefs and so much that, it's taking a long time to recover. In Camotes, it was different because the percentage of the MPAs that were managed well was all of the 12 MPAs. And the people believe that management is functional and that there's a decrease in illegal fishing. But the people also believe that the contributions of the MPAs to improving fisheries is still quite low because historically in Camotes, the fisheries has been really exploited. So that's why it's also taking a long time to recover. That's how the people see it. In Lanuza, it's different because everything seems to be going well in terms of the individual MPAs because communities are really involved in the management. And then everyone in their own communities believe that the MPAs are really contributing a lot to improving their fisheries resources. So the individual MPA assessment of the older MPAs were well managed compared to the younger ones. And then the management depends on the priorities and strengths of managers. I said that there's mixed management for the 3 sites. So the private institutions that manage their MPAs were more equipped and had higher capacity to implement their activities, whereas communities have a harder time. But all of the sites that were assessed, they said that enforcement was the most important activity. And to conduct your patrols, they need to have the legal basis and the community participation because they need the support of the communities. So to conclude this chapter, I saw that the network and the individual MPA management are interdependent because networks need experienced local governments and MPA managers for lessons. And then the MPAs improve faster due to the lessons from other people and managers and the additional activities because when you have the joint patrols conducted by the networks, that also improves, that also helps with the enforcement of the individual MPAs. And then managers themselves get capacity building from the network when that's supported by the network. So that helps them increase their management skills. And for instance, they could do their own patrol monitoring and evaluation because they're trained to dive and things like that. And then I also found out that there are numerous factors that influence the performance of the networks. So why one of them was good and why wasn't doing so well. And that leads me to my last chapter, which is the factors that influence the performance of MPA networks. And in this chapter, I looked at the effects of increasing network sizes, the effects of governance structure and arrangements, and the socioeconomic and political complexity. And I also looked at the beliefs about the distribution of costs and benefits. So the things we know about networks, I already said earlier, they have different levels of engagement and complexity and formality. And it also involves several governance units that works together, but they can also operate autonomously, so they can make decisions for their own towns and what they want to do. And performance is dependent on membership structure, relationships, experiences, and social norms. So how they relate to each other, if they're working well because all their relationships are good. And participation is also dependent on trust, interest, and political obligations. So when you have a lot of members that are actively participating, the network performs better. So with this, conducted interviews and then the group discussions from the 3rd chapter as well with government. So there are basically all the network members. And then I also looked at their documents, like the Memorandum of Understanding and their bylaws, minutes of meetings. And I analyzed these because I wanted to know how they work and what they're exactly doing. And I also looked at attributes of each network, of each town in each network. So for context, just to remind you, the size is, the largest one is Batangas, the smallest one is Camotes. In terms of structure, Batangas is self-organized, but then it's also facilitated by the provincial government. That's why it's a provincial network. Whereas Camotes is self-organized, so it's just the 5 towns working together. Lanuza is also different, and it's quite special because there are 7 local governments, and they hired someone to help them get themselves organized and for project management and project development. So in terms of members, the members include, and Batangas include employees and community leaders, whereas Camotes is composed of government officials and employees, whereas Lanuza is composed of government officials. When I say government officials, they're the local chief executives. In terms of arrangement, one example would be financing. Batangas has counterparting, where I give you money and then you give me money and then we share that. And then Camotes, everyone's required, Camotes and Lanuza are required to give annual contributions to their mutual fund system. In terms of complexity, Batangas is more developed. 8 towns in Batangas are first-class municipalities with an income of greater than $1.37 million, whereas Camotes and Lanuza are less developed, so most of their towns range from the second class to the 5th class, so which range from $1.37 million to $375,000 as their average annual income. Fisheries dependence is low in Batangas because there's a lot of options for their livelihoods, and they have tourism, they have livestock farming, they have industries. There's a lot of power plants and refineries in Batangas. Camotes is low, they only have tourism and a little bit of farming because they're highly dependent on their fisheries, so they have a lot of fishermen. Lanuza, it's both moderate, so they depend on their fisheries resources, but they also have a lot of options, particularly in the agricultural sector. They also have started initiating works on tourism and mining. So, my results show that the size, structure, and arrangements, it varies. So, the influence of size is not apparent. Theoretically, in the literature, we know that larger networks are harder and more expensive to organize compared to smaller ones. But it wasn't that apparent because the structure and arrangements drive participation more. And for instance, in terms of arrangements, it's the actual cost of participating that drives them to come as well to participate in activities in the network. In some cases, the mutual fund system is actually not as good as compared to counterparting because it's more expensive because the local governments have to give money every year, and if they go see that their money's going into good activities and funding a lot of activities that they're interested in, and if they're not getting their money's worth, they're not that interested. Whereas if you're just counterparting and when you're paying when it's just necessary, where local governments, oh, I'll attend a meeting, I'll attend a training, I'll pay for my fares, and the provincial government provides the money for the activities, then it's actually better and it's actually cheaper for them to participate. In terms of structure, in every network, I saw that strong leadership ensures participation. There's an interesting term that we call in Filipino, we say makulit, and this is equated as persistent. So persistence is actually equated as strong, because if the leader keeps coming and keeps telling you, please come, please attend and join us, that actually makes them participate more. And then the other things that I looked at was the benefits of participating, and is that the benefits of participating outweighs the cost. So, for instance, if they feel the members feel that they're benefiting a lot from the network, they participate more because they're learning more, they're getting to increase their capacity. Other times it's just competitiveness because they don't want to be left out. They don't want their town to be left out. And the other factors can cause disinterest as well. This informant is participating, but it's not wholeheartedly because he felt that they were not getting their money's worth and they're not moving forward with the network. So that causes the disinterest. In other cases, it's also because there's just a project. So they were joining because there's a project in there that they have in the network, and so they were active. But then when the project ended, they don't get their share of the funds and the money, they don't attend anymore. And it's also because they also have different priority. So, and this leads to complexity. So originally, this network starts with a mutual understanding of that they cannot solve their problems on their own. They have to work together. And so they have a shared vision and common goals. But then, since they operate autonomously as well, they can have differences in development objectives and priorities, and this affects their participation in the network. So these differences in development objectives and priorities are related to relative importance of fisheries and coastal resources, the availability and diversity of alternative livelihood options, the state of remaining natural resources, and the levels of exploitation of various natural resources. Because if the network's resources are not exploited as much, it's kind of easier to implement the networks. And then at the same time, if they have a lot more options to give for their fishes to exit fisheries, that also improves the network as well. And sometimes in the cases wherein they don't have a lot of remaining natural resources, their only choice is to protect their coastal resources. And so that makes them participate more, and they protect their resources more. And in terms of the levels of exploitation, so if they could explore other sources of other sources wherein they could improve their towns, that's where they tend to diverge from the network as well. So in my conclusions, size did not have an apparent effect on participation because it seemed like the larger network had more people and more actively participating in the group. And then it was in the project as well, it was shown that the structure, arrangements, beliefs, and complexity affects participation more, as shown in my results. And this is influenced by local scale dynamics, and this changes over time as well. The political leaders can change, so when they change, they would have a different priority, so that would also affect the network. And it's same as the other institutional analysis. There's no one recipe for the structure and the arrangement of the network, but this was the apparent things that was shown to be the most important things in my work, that they need a strong leader, they need transparency, accountability measures, and incentive systems, because this motivates them to participate and perform well. If you have a strong leader that tells you and reminds you and cheers you up, it makes them work better. And if they have transparency and the other things, they're required to report, they're required to do what they're told. There are measures for them that make them do what they need to do. And if they're rewarded occasionally for their hard work, that's also really important to them. So general conclusions, as shown in the chapters, the value-added benefits of scaling up to form MP networks include better design, accelerated establishment, and improved management. But we have to exercise caution when we're recommending and using this approach, because then when you're making people work together and they're really different, for instance, it's going to be hard, and that's going to cost a lot of money too. And then at the same time, if they believe that the distribution of the costs and benefits is not equitable, that also makes the network not work so well and reduce the people that you want to work with. So that's the end of my thesis. These are the publications that I did. The first chapter is already published. The third one's being submitted next week. I also worked with other people to write other publications. I presented in 3 international conferences with the first to third chapters. I also participated in workshops as a research person and a workshop facilitator for the Coral Triangle Initiative. And then I also got these grants for my thesis. Thank you! I'm sorry, but I really need to thank these people, because I wouldn't have been able to do my research without funding, support, and opportunity from these organizations, the Center, the Marine Science Institute, Conservation International, WARE, the MPA Support Network, and Roofer Small Grants, and then my supervisors for guiding me through this entire process, and my collaborators, and then of course everyone here in this room. Maraming salamat.